Right, so the Houthis managed to cripple a US warship in the Red Sea, have they, Damo? It's a story reminiscent of one from last year, isn't it, when rumours abounded for a few days as to whether the Houthis had actually sunk a US warship. But when that turned out to not be true, the ship in question had actually just fled the area, this time there is an element of truth to the tale, it seems. All of this has come amid the ongoing tit-for-tat attacks between US forces striking civilian areas of Yemen, from the airport to a catastrophic strike on a Yemeni water supply, whilst the Houthis have maintained their attacks on Israel as well in support of Gaza. Where the US acts against civilians in Yemen in support of a nation genociding more civilians in Gaza, the Houthis act in solidarity with those oppressed people in Gaza. And as much as no violence should ever be condoned, there's a chasm between what is driving both sides here. Aside from the actual conflict, though, the US ramping up its attacks against the Houthis is costing them a fortune. Fighting a group they've had no prior real success at eliminating, and despite Trump's claims to the contrary, there's no sign of that changing whatsoever. The US is engaged in an amoral, expensive war with the Houthis that is virtually guaranteed to be doomed to failure. So what does he do now, then? He's sending another warship. Right, so the United States' relentless military campaign against Yemen's Houthi movement has backfired spectacularly, frankly, in a massively underreported story, which is probably because it is so embarrassing for them, the world's biggest superpower, to have its flagship in the Red Sea, the USS Truman, crippled by a group with no navy at all of their own. Far from decimating the Houthis, as the Cheeto-dusted president of the US, Donald Trump, has claimed, the US has instead found itself mired in an unwinnable conflict, hemorrhaging billions of dollars in failed airstrikes, while the Houthis continue to strike Israeli and American targets with impunity. So let's get into this business of the Houthis crippling a US warship then. The ship in question was none other than the American flagship in the Red Sea, the Harry S. Truman, and it has been severely hampered after Houthi forces launched 3 precision strikes against it within 24 hours at the beginning of this month. It wasn't a strike on the ship itself that crippled it, though. The Houthis picked their target much more carefully, because the most devastating blow came when they successfully hit the carrier's E-2 Hawkeye, the Truman's critical command and control aircraft. The E-2 Hawkeye is an eyes of ears type of an aircraft in a carrier battle group. It provides airborne early warnings, battle management, surveillance and reconnaissance. It essentially coordinates all operations from above, from the air. Without it, the Truman's ability to detect incoming threats, direct fighter jets and maintain situational awareness becomes severely compromised. It isn't clear to what extent that craft was actually damaged by the Houthis, just as it was sufficient enough to screw up the then US attacks on them, at least for a short time. Airstrikes in the last 24 hours by the US on Yemen itself, no specific Houthi targets again because they don't actually know where they are, they lack intelligence on that, have certainly not brought US aggression to an end though. So instead of reassessing its strategy versus the Houthis, not least in consideration of the historical failures the US has endured every single time they fought the Houthis before, Trump, in his infinite lack of wisdom, via his even more lacking in wisdom Defense Secretary and signal-gated dumbass as he's best known as these days, Pete Hegseth, has now dispatched another warship to the Red Sea, the USS Carl Vinson, another carrier just like the Truman, another very, very costly and likely futile move. Just another target for the Houthis in all likelihood, as this is going to be. The Houthis have already proven they can hit moving targets at sea, meaning additional vessels may simply become more expensive liabilities. It's just another target for them to have a pop at. Throughout these events, the US have continued to make airstrikes on Yemen, and just hours after US airstrikes pounded Yemen and the Houthis respond both in kind and by firing ballistic missiles at Israel, a favoured target of theirs continuing to be Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport, the Yemeni armed forces issued a statement in relation to this, covered as it was by the cradle. The missile force targeted Ben Gurion Airport in the occupied Jaffa, Tel Aviv area with a Zulfikar ballistic missile and a military target south of occupied Jaffa with a Palestine II hypersonic ballistic missile. The operation successfully achieved its goal, the YAF said in a statement. The Israeli army announced in a statement that following the sirens that sounded a short while ago in several areas in Israel, 2 missiles launched from Yemen were intercepted prior to crossing into Israeli territory, adding that sirens were sounded in accordance with protocol. So the sirens are only sounded in accordance with protocol then, isn't it? No, not in any way to cause people to flee for shelters or anything like that. And of course, the fact that these rockets or parts of them fell in the general area of Ben Gurion Airport again certainly sorts of implies that the rocket certainly made it a bit further into Israeli territory than Israel would like to have you believe. But this is, of course, a pattern that's repeated for months, isn't it? Every US escalation is met with an immediate Houthi response against both the US and continued strikes on Israel, reinforcing their commitment to Gaza. We've seen it for months and months and months. We had a break while the Gaza ceasefire was on, but now it's back to normal service, it seems, isn't it? Because the US won't back down, and neither will the Houthis. And Israel certainly don't seem to be getting out of Gaza anytime soon. Nothing the US has said or done has changed since Israel resumed its genocide in Gaza, so the stance of the Houthis hasn't either. The defiance of the Houthis in the face of US attacks on them for daring to support the people of Gaza and take the fight directly to Israel's own doorstep when few others seem prepared to, have been exemplified by their own leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, in comments he's made. The US escalation aims to isolate the Palestinian people, pressure those who support their cause, including Iran, Iraq, Lebanon and even South Africa, and silence humanitarian voices in the US and Europe under the pretext of anti-Semitism, Houthi said during a televised speech commemorating International Quds Day. The US and Israeli enemies commit genocide against children and women, killing infants even in hospital nurseries, and regard humans like animals, the leader of the Ansar Allah resistance movement added. So no amount of bombing is going to deter the Houthis from their core objective here. That's their leader. They simply are not built that way. US airstrikes have continued to repeatedly hit Yemen's main civilian airport in Sana'a, further crippling a country already suffering from near famine conditions itself. Even more egregiously, a recent strike destroyed a water facility that serves 50,000 people, as well as killing 4 civilians in the process. These are the targets the US is deliberately choosing when it has no strategic military target to go after in Yemen, i.e. the Houthis. It just lashes out. What is it doing in Yemen that's much different to what Israel's doing in Gaza, frankly? Strikes what it likes, civilians are killed, nothing fundamentally changes. When the Houthis aren't just firing straight after, but have even been known to be firing on Israel and the US at the same time the US have been firing on them, or allegedly on them, because they don't know where they are, do they? The US is prioritising brute force over precision, and it just doesn't work with a group like the Houthis. They don't respond to it. It'll never work, except to force them to bite back again, and they will keep biting back, the honey badgers of the Middle East as they are thought of. It doesn't matter if they are outgunned. They are outsmarting the US. They are tactically going toe-to-toe with them. It's all happening in their backyard, after all. And the only way things will end will be when, as the Houthis so often say, their objectives have been achieved. Speaking of which, in another example of the US being outflanked and the expense of their fighting the Houthis increases to the tune of millions, the Houthis have shot down yet another of their MQ-9 Reaper drones. These are worth $30 million apiece on their own. It's the second one they've downed this week. And this is also reminiscent of a familiar pattern that has been seen throughout US attacks on Yemen since the Gaza genocide began. The US throw the most expensive rockets worth tens of thousands apiece, drones worth millions at the Houthis, and they get downed by drones that cost a couple $100. Multi-million dollars drones get downed like this one has, by far cheaper ordnance that the Houthis are using. There always seems to be a cost-effective answer to advanced US technology being used against the Houthis. It gets routinely neutralised by the Houthis and their tactics, and the longer it rumbles on, the bigger the US bill becomes, as the Houthis, by comparison, are spending peanuts. It isn't stopping the US, though. The big orange man baby just spends more and more. The US has dramatically escalated its bombing, conducting 27 airstrikes in 12 hours overnight in Yemen, and yet the Houthis remain undeterred. How many more billions of US dollars must be wasted before Washington admits this strategy of fighting the Houthis is failing, because it is doomed to failure? They cannot win this way. The US campaign in Yemen is a textbook case of strategic failure. They have no answer to the Houthis and think spending more and more and more will eventually work. Always money for war, of course, isn't there? The Houthis have proven resilient, adaptive and ideologically committed. And these are qualities that cannot simply be bombed away. Meanwhile, the humanitarian toll grows, and the US, having had its USS Harry S. Truman hobbled, at least for a bit, now sits as a symbol of American overreach. If the US carries on down this path, and it will, because idiots like Trump and the fools he surrounds himself with know of no other way, it will only deepen the crisis whilst achieving nothing. The only logical solution is a ceasefire in Gaza, which is the root cause of Houthi operations. It is their condition for stopping their actions, and an end to the indiscriminate bombing of Yemen being measured in civilian lives much more than Houthi ones. Anything less is an expensive, bloody folly. Meanwhile, speaking of things that don't seem to work, Israel's Iron Dome, let's talk about that, shall we? Can't seem to stop the Houthis anymore either, can it? Did they not think to fix the thing during the Gaza ceasefire, or have the Houthis simply found a way around all of those air defences, which means they can keep on reaching Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion Airport? They never used to be able to get so far north, did they? And now they do it on a daily basis. So what's going on there? Well, find out all about that in this story, in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as supporting the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.